Yeah, and so going more into those textiles and fibers side of it, can you talk about some of the specific textiles and fibers that are being used in creating outdoor apparel and if they differ at all from those used in indoor apparel?
Yeah, sure thing. So humans have been wearing clothing since for at least 170,000 years. And of course, all the early clothing, all the way up to the advent of synthetic fibers, have been natural based, right? Cotton,
Right.
wool, silk. And then with the advent of synthetic fibers like polypropylene, nylon, polyester, which happened just in the last century, we had access to materials that had different properties. For example, if you look at the natural materials like wool, cotton, silk, and others, they're pretty hydrophilic in general, meaning they absorb moisture. And if you look at a lot of the synthetic materials, they tend more toward hydrophobic, which means they don't absorb as much moisture. So polypropylene, polyester, nylon. And so that could actually, just from that property alone, you can imagine that might be useful for something you'd want to wear outside to keep yourself dry, right? Something that's going to be hydrophobic, not going to absorb as much rain. It's not going to absorb as much sweat. With active human in the outdoors, and your body's putting off a lot of moisture. As long as that material can breathe, it'll go through there as opposed to absorbing into that material and being held there. So a lot of the materials that are used in the outdoor space for apparel and footwear really are synthetic based. Polyester is a big one. Nylon's a big one. Polypropylene used a little bit, not as much as it used to be, but mostly more synthetic than the natural materials, I would say. But again, these are all the major fiber classes.
You mentioned this, how humans have been wearing clothes for the past 170,000 years. And I think that's a really cool topic that we could dive into. So let's talk about the history of clothing and how it aligns with the history of material development. You told us before, mankind's first examples of clothing were furs, skins, and even whale intestines that were sewn together to be waterproof, right? So clearly we've come a long way since then. So can you talk about how material advancements over time have translated to innovations in the apparel industry?
Yeah, sure. You just mentioned it, some of the early materials. And if you look at materials, and what I remind my team members and people that I hire, and actually people that I meet all the time, what I remind them of all the time is remember your fundamentals. View the world through the lens of fundamentally through as a scientist or an engineer. Don't forget what you learned in college. Or even high school, for that matter. For most folks who major in science or engineering in college, they took chemistry in high school. I often will go back to just high school chemistry to remind people that, that's a really useful way to view the world when you're doing the kinds of things that I'm doing and the people that I work with are doing. And the reason I say that, because you look at the natural materials that are used to keep people protected in the outdoors, furs, fibers. If you think about it fundamentally in terms of the kinds of materials that keep people warm, we use that as a first example. It's really just trapped air. Air works as a good insulator because it has a low thermal conductivity. And so all the furs, bundles of fibers that are stuffed between different layers of fabrics, it's just different forms of trapped air. Now, a lot of brands, including us, will make a big deal about all our different insulations. We've got down, we've got synthetic, but the truth is they're all just different forms of trapped air. And if you view it in that light, then it allows you to actually think about it, I think, a little bit differently, right? Well, if the insulating component is really just the air, then everything else is just the container, right? Mm-hmm. So what is it about the container, whether it's feathers or fur, what is it about the container that makes it a good container for trapping air? How could it be improved? And, where do we go from here? All right. And so from fur and feathers, we went to actually most insulation nowadays, most traditional insulation is synthetic fibers, either continuous filament sheet, what we call sheet insulation, or chopped up synthetic fibers that we refer to in the industry as faux down. These are just different forms of trapped air. And if you do it that way, then I think that's a good platform from which to think about, how can we make it better? So that's one example. The other example, I don't know if you want to go into this now, is really rain protection. Because I love the example that we talked about earlier, and you mentioned a second ago, was whale intestines or seal intestines.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, go into it. I want to hear it.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the big areas that all outdoor companies look at is protection from rain. And if you look at what humans used to wear in terms of protecting themselves from rain, a lot of times it was just materials that would sufficiently shed rainfall that, it wouldn't absorb into the material and wouldn't get next to the skin. And so that's kind of an interesting example, sort of whale intestines that were kind of glued together to form garments to keep people dry. And other examples are bundles of thatch. You've maybe seen roofing materials for old buildings that were sort of straw or thatch, it's called. So that was actually used as well back in the day to shed rainfall. But the whale intestine thing is not widely available to all humans.
Maybe for good reason.
And, even though the thatch type raincoat might be available to a larger fraction of humans on the planet, that thing's pretty heavy in terms of you can imagine a thatch roof wearing that as a garment to keep the rain off. And so a lot of the modern materials, which I mentioned a second ago, which are based on synthetic materials, which are hydrophobic, they do a good job at shedding rainfall, but they don't necessarily keep you completely dry unless it's a continuous film. And so, for example, a textile fabric, and a fabric is just a collection of yarns that are interlaced, and yarns are made of fibers, is actually mostly air itself. We don't typically think of it that way, but if you actually do a calculation, measure the thickness of the fabric and look at the density of the material, whether it's polyester or nylon, and calculate the density of the fabric versus the density of the material. If it was 100% polyester, 100% nylon, you'll find that most fabrics are more air than solid material. So as a result, even though the hydrophobic materials do a pretty good job of shedding moisture to keep you dry, they won't keep you completely dry, especially if you're in a really, really bad rainstorm. And so as a result, the industry has settled on a series of materials that we call fabric membrane laminates. And so we have a fabric, which again, as I said, is mostly air. And what I mean by that, it's got a lot of holes in it. And then we take a film and we actually laminate that film to the fabric. And the film itself is very, very thin, 30 microns typically, or smaller in terms of the thickness. And that film itself has a lot of microscopic holes in it. And what it does is does a better job of keeping the water out, but due to the microscopic holes in there, actually allows it to breathe a little bit as well. So it brings up another topic in terms of keeping the rain out and allowing you to breathe. There's always a trade-off when you're trying to develop these new materials in the outdoor space.
I just had a follow-up. So is that hole size meant to be smaller than typical water droplets, but large enough so that air can flow through it? Is that what the goal is, or what's the deal there?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I really love clarifying this, because if you read the internet, you'll see that a lot of explanations that exist for what are referred to as waterproof, breathable fabric membrane laminates talk about the importance of the size of the holes in the membrane part of the membrane fabric laminate. And it is important. The truth is you want those holes to be as small as possible so that they can resist rain getting through. But you also want them, on the other hand, you want them as large as possible so they can actually transport as much moisture as the body is giving off. And, human at rest, these materials are actually quite good. But when humans get active, they actually start to put off a good deal of moisture, and it becomes really challenging for these fabric membrane laminates to keep up. So it's not just the size itself. So to get back to where I was going there, it's not just the size of the hole itself that's important, but it's actually the surface tension or surface energy of the material itself. And so, for example, this entire category of material that are used in the outdoor space to keep people dry and yet still breathe was, to my understanding, was really developed in the 1970s by a company called Gore, where they created this material as expanded polytetrafluoroethylene. And expanded polytetrafluoroethylene was really kind of the first membrane that was used on a widespread basis in fabric membrane laminates to keep people dry, but also allow moisture from the body to actually get through it. So those holes are very small. The world knows this material is Gore-Tex. But the other thing is that polytetrafluoroethylene has very low surface energy. And so raindrops It takes more pressure to get rain to go through a material like that than it does for most other materials. The bottom line is not just the size of the hole itself, it's actually the surface energy as well.